This 1899 family portrait was restored, and only now did a hidden secret come to light. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Morgan's restoration studio in Philadelphia, throwing long shadows across her work table. She adjusted her magnifying lamp and focused on the photograph that had arrived earlier that day, a family portrait from 1899 set inside a cracked leather frame. The image was faint and hard to see, damaged by water stains, age marks, and a deep crease cutting diagonally across the lower section. The client's email had been short and simple. Found this in my grandmother's attic. Family portrait. Would love to see it restored before I pass it down to my daughter. Morgan had spent 12 years restoring historical photographs and had handled countless portraits from the late 19th century. At first glance, this one seemed ordinary. 4 figures stood posed in the stiff, formal style common to that era. A man and a woman stood in the back, their faces serious and composed. 2 younger people, likely their grown children, stood on either side. Morgan gently removed the photograph from its frame, noticing the fragile edges and the foxing that had eaten away at parts of the surface. On the back, the studio mark was only partly readable. Richardson's photography, Philadelphia, Paul, 1899. She set up her scanner and began the careful process of digitizing the image. Morgan always worked at the highest resolution she could, knowing that details invisible to the naked eye might appear once magnified. When the scan finished, she moved the file to a main screen and opened it in her restoration software. Her first step never changed. She assessed the damage, mapped out the problem areas, and planned the restoration. Slowly, she zoomed in on each section. The faces were worn, but could be recovered. The background, likely a painted studio backdrop showing a Victorian parlor, was faded but mostly intact. Then something caught her attention near the bottom of the image, right where the crease had destroyed most of the detail. She leaned closer to the screen. There was a shape there, something she had first assumed was only shadow or damage. When she adjusted the contrast slightly, the shape seemed to take form. Morgan felt her pulse quicken. Over the years, she had learned to trust moments like this, when an image seemed to whisper that it was hiding more than it showed. She saved her progress and stood up to stretch. The next day, she would begin rebuilding that damaged section pixel by pixel. She had no idea she was about to uncover a secret hidden for 125 years. Morgan arrived early the following morning, coffee in hand and purpose in her step. The 1899 portrait waited on her screen just as she had left it. The strange shape in the damaged area still lingered in her thoughts. She had even dreamed about it, broken images of shadows turning solid, of secrets hiding in plain sight. She sat down and began the slow, detailed work of digital restoration. Using advanced tools and her trained eye, she reconstructed the damaged area pixel by pixel. The software suggested patterns and textures based on surrounding areas, but Morgan always made the final choice guided by experience and instinct. After 2 hours of intense focus, she leaned back and rubbed her eyes. The shape was clearly not damaged. It had a rounded top that narrowed downward. She increased the zoom and continued working, carefully removing marks left by water and time. By midday, the truth was impossible to ignore. It was a head, a small one, positioned low in the frame, as if someone were sitting on the floor or a very low stool. A child. Morgan's heart began to race. She opened the client's email again and reread it carefully. 4 people. The family records mentioned only 4. Yet here, slowly emerging after more than a century, was a clear 5th figure. She worked through lunch, forgetting the sandwich beside her keyboard. As more of the image returned, details appeared. Small shoulders, the outline of a simple dress, tiny hands folded neatly in a lap. The child looked to be around 4 or 5 years old, seated slightly forward, and to the left of the woman Morgan now believed was the family's mother. The placement felt strange. In most Victorian family portraits, children were placed front and center as symbols of family and future. This child, however, seemed tucked away, present but not highlighted, visible but not emphasized. By late afternoon, enough of the child's face had been restored for features to emerge. Morgan carefully adjusted brightness and contrast, pulling detail from the damaged surface. The eyes were lowered, the expression serious, common for photographs taken during long exposures. Then she enhanced the lighting in that area, a standard method to recover underexposed detail. The screen refreshed, and Morgan froze. The child's skin tone, now clearly visible, was much lighter than the four adults around her. Significantly lighter. Morgan leaned back, her thoughts racing. A black family in 1899 Philadelphia, with a white child seated among them, photographed as though she belonged there. This was no longer just restoration work. It was a mystery. She spent the rest of the day finishing the basic restoration, but her mind stayed fixed on the fifth figure. By evening, the image was clear. 5 people stared back across more than a century. The parents stood in formal clothing, calm and proud. The 2 young adults beside them wore similar expressions, and at the front sat the small white child, blonde hair pulled back, pale hands folded carefully in her lap. Morgan saved several versions of the file and then did something she rarely did before completing a project. She called the client. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Morgan Chen from the restoration studio. I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all, dear," came the warm reply. "Have you looked at the photograph?" "I have, and I've made good progress. But I need to ask you something. What do you know about the family in this portrait?" There was a short pause. "Those are my great-great-grandparents, Thomas and Ruth, and their children, Samuel and Grace." "Why?" Morgan chose her words with care. "During restoration, I discovered there's actually a 5th person in the photograph, a young child, about 4 or 5 years old. Damage had hidden her, but I've recovered the image. Were you aware of another child?" Silence stretched across the line. "A 5th person?" Mrs. Patterson's voice softened. "No, I've never heard of another child. Are you sure?" "I'm completely certain." She's seated at the front. "And there's something else. The child appears to be white." Another long pause. "White? That doesn't make sense. Thomas and Ruth were black. Everyone in the family was. We have records, Bible entries, everything. There's never been any mention of." Her voice faded. "I know this is unexpected," Morgan said gently. "I'll send you the restored image. Maybe look through your family papers. There may be something that explains it." "Yes," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "My grandmother left boxes of letters. I never went through most of them." "Morgan, if this is true, it changes what we can. How about our family?" After the call ended, Morgan sat alone in the dim studio, staring at the photograph. 4 faces remembered and recorded. 1 face erased by time, silence, and deliberate forgetting. She zoomed in on the child's face. "Who were you?" she wondered. "And why were you hidden?" 3 days later, Morgan's phone rang at 9 in the morning. It was Mrs. Patterson, her voice filled with excitement and confusion. "I found something," she said. "Letters. Letters from Ruth to her sister in New York, dated between 1897 and 1902. Morgan grabbed her notebook. "What do they say?" "Mostly everyday things. Church news, recipes. But there's one from September 1899, just months after the photo. Ruth writes, 'The child is well and growing. We have made peace with the looks we receive at market. Thomas says we do what is right before God, and that is enough. Sarah has learned our names, and her laughter fills the house.'" Morgan felt a rush of discovery. "Sarah? Yes, there's no Sarah in our family tree. And there are more mentions, always careful. In 1900, Ruth writes about church women asking questions they refuse to answer. And in 1901, she writes that Sarah is asking about her mother. She says, "She is ours now in all the ways that matter." Morgan wrote quickly. "Does Ruth ever explain how Sarah came to them?" "Not directly, but there's a letter from December 1896. Ruth writes about a woman who fell at the docks. She died. She had a child, barely 2. No one claim. Her. Thomas brought the child to the church." Morgan imagined the scene, a busy Philadelphia dock, a fallen woman, a crying child left behind, a black man stepping forward when others did not. Mrs. Patterson's voice dropped. "In 1896, during Jim Crow, a black family raising a white child would have been dangerous. People would have assumed something criminal. They could have lost everything. But they did it anyway." Morgan said softly, "Yes." And then Sarah disappears from the letters after 1902. Morgan looked again at the photograph. "We need to find her story." Over the next week, Morgan searched records. In the 1900 census, she found Thomas and Ruth listed with their children, and in the margin, written in a different hand, squeezed in as if added later, was Sarah, age 5, white. Church records confirmed more. At St. Thomas African Episcopal Church, Morgan found entries noting Ruth had taken in an orphan child. Sarah was baptized in 1899. Parents listed as Thomas and Ruth Parker. They claimed her in the only way they legally could. That evening, Morgan met Mrs. Patterson at a small cafe. The older woman brought a box of documents, opened the family Bible. Morgan scanned the birth record, Samuel, Grace, and then, written later, in different ink, Sarah, born around 1894, came to us in 1896. Blessed be God who gave us this precious gift. Ruth wrote that, Mrs. Patterson said softly. My grandmother told me Ruth kept the family Bible with great care. Every birth, every death, every marriage was written down. Sarah is written there, Morgan. She's written there as family. Morgan slowly turned the pages. Marriages, deaths, the births of grandchildren, all carefully recorded in Ruth. As neat handwriting. The final entry written by Ruth was dated 1903. Thomas gone to his rest, age 45, beloved husband and father. Thomas died young, Morgan said quietly. Family stories say it was an accident at the docks. He was unloading cargo when something fell on him. He died instantly. Mrs. Patterson stared off into the distance. Ruth lived a note. Her 30 years after that, she raised her children and grandchildren, but she never married again. Morgan turned back to Sarah's entry. Mrs. Patterson, what happened to Sarah? The letters stop in 1902, and there's no death written here in the Bible. I don't know, and that's what scares me. The older woman's hands shook slightly as she closed the Bible. In all the stories my grandmother told me, in all the papers and photographs, there's nothing about Sarah after that picture. It's like she just disappeared. Morgan's next visit was to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. She asked for access to Philadelphia newspaper archives from 1900 to 1905. If something had happened to Sarah, something serious enough to erase her from memory, there would likely be a record. She began with the Philadelphia Inquirer, scrolling through fragile microfilm filled with social notice, crime stories, and ads for miracle cures and corsets. The city appeared in broken pieces. Wealth and poverty side by side, grand houses near crowded tenements, progress and prejudice moving together along stone streets. On her third day in the archives, she found it. A small article buried on page 7 of the January 14th, 1902 edition. The headline read, Authorities investigate household irregularity. Morgan's hands trembled as she read. Police were called to a home on Lombard Street after neighbors complained about a white child living with Thomas and Ruth Parker, both colored. The child, Sarah, about age 7, had lived with the family for several years. A neighbor, Mrs. Henrietta Worthington, expressed concern for the child's welfare and moral upbringing. It is not proper, she said, that the child remain in such a home. The Parkers declined to comment. The matter was referred to the Philadelphia Society for Organizing Charity. Morgan felt sick. She photographed the article and continued searching. 2 weeks later, she found another short notice. The society had decided the child, Sarah, was to be removed and placed in a suitable home. The statement said that while the colored family seemed to have cared for her, it was in the child's best interest to be raised among her own race and class. Morgan called Mrs. Patterson, her hands shaking. They took her, she said as soon as the call connected. In 1902, they took Sarah away from Thomas and Ruth. The silence on the line was heavy with pain. Because of their skin color, Mrs. Patterson finally said. Because a neighbor complained. Because someone decided a white child couldn't belong with a black family no matter how much they loved her, Morgan said, her voice breaking. This is why the letters stop. This is why she vanished from the record. Did they say where they took her? Mrs. Patterson asked. Only that it was a suitable home. No name, no place. Morgan rubbed her eyes, angry and exhausted. I'm going to find out what happened to her. The Society for Organizing Charity kept records. There has to be a trail, Morgan, Mrs. Patterson said through tears. Thomas and Ruth kept that photograph. Even after Sarah was taken, they kept it. They could have destroyed it, but they didn't. They hid her in the picture where she would be safe. Safe from judgment. Safe from a world that wouldn't understand. Morgan looked at the restored image on her screen. The small child sitting with the family who had loved her enough to risk everything. Then we owe it to them to tell the truth, she said. The society had closed in 1934, but its files were stored in the city archives. Morgan submitted a request, explaining she was researching a 1902 case involving a child named Sarah. 2 days later, an archivist named Jessica called her. "I found the file," she said, "and there's a lot in it." Morgan arrived within the hour. Jessica placed a cardboard box on the table. One folder was marked Parker Household, Lombard Street, 1902. Morgan opened it carefully. The first paper was a formal complaint signed by Henrietta Worthington. The language was polite, but the message was harsh. A white child living with a colored family was unacceptable. Immediate action was demanded. Next was an interview report with Thomas and Ruth Parker. Ruth's words were written by the investigator. She explained that Sarah came to them in December 1896 after her mother died at the docks. No papers were found. No family came forward. Ruth said they raised the child as their own, took her to church, taught her right from wrong, and loved her fully. When Ked why they didn't turn her over to authorities. Ruth said she was crying and alone. What kind of Christian could walk away from that? The notes in the margin were cold. Despite adequate care, the society determined the child's moral development was at risk. Immediate removal was recommended. Morgan wiped her eyes. The next document was the removal order dated January 28, 1902. Sarah was taken to the Philadelphia Home for Infants. Then came the adoption record from March 1902. Sarah, age 8, adopted by Charles and Adelaide Brennan of Germantown. The report noted she was healthy and well-behaved despite her previous placement. The final document was a follow-up visit. Mrs. Crane reported that Sarah was quiet and obedient but not attached to her new family. She often asked for Mama Ruth and Papa Thomas, and became upset when told to forget them. Mrs. Brennan believed time and discipline would fix this. Morgan closed the file, her heart aching for the little girl taken from the only home she knew. She photographed everything and asked Jessica if Sarah could be traced further. "Adoption records are sealed," Jessica said, "but the Brennans lived in Germantown. If Sarah stayed, she'd appear in census records, and if she married, there'd be a certificate. It's a long shot, but sometimes we get lucky." Morgan followed every lead. The 1910 census showed Sarah Brennan, age 16, adopted daughter. In 1920, she was gone. Morgan searched marriage records, death certificates, rectories. Then she found it. A marriage record from 1918. Sarah Brennan married William Foster. She traced them through later censuses. Children. A life. In 1940, Sarah was still alive. Together, Morgan and Mrs. Patterson found Sarah's descendants. Margaret Foster Coleman, age 87. Morgan called her. When they met, Margaret stared at the photograph and cried. She spoke of a grandmother who remembered another mother, a woman named Ruth. The story came full circle. The families embraced. The church held a ceremony. Sarah's name was spoken aloud. Sarah Parker. Love had survived. Memory had returned. Sarah had finally come home.